Hello, and welcome to This Week in the Garden. For this first episode of Week 1, we're going to talk about how to plan a garden and all of the things that you need to consider along the way. Now, we're not out in the garden this week because we've gotten a lot of rain here, but we do have some images and some videos to show you along the way. So the three questions you need to ask yourself are: 1, what do you like to eat, or what do you want to grow? And that's pretty self-explanatory. You shouldn't be growing things you don't want to eat, because then what are you going to do with them? If I grow a lot of eggplant, I'm not going to want to take care of them because I'm not going to eat them. And so if it gets a disease, I'm less likely to care about it. So that's the first thing. Consider what you want to grow. The next thing is to consider how much you want to grow. If you're a family of 2, maybe you just want enough food for you to eat throughout the summer, and so you might not need a huge garden. Or maybe you're a family of 4 and you want to grow a lot of food to be eating every day, and then you want to store some as well, so you might need a huge garden. So that's something to consider, and that'll determine how much space you need for your garden. That'll help you decide where to put it. And then the last thing is, how much do you want to spend on your garden? Some people don't want to spend a lot of money, and so something like a small patio garden might be perfect for you. Or maybe you want a huge, elegant, raised bed garden, and that might cost a lot of money. So consider the budget as well. And we'll stop and go through each of these questions with examples from my garden and how I dealt with each of those. So for the first question, what do I like to eat, or what do I want to grow? I sat down with my wife and we looked at our weekly menu and looked at a lot of the foods that we eat pretty regularly. We eat a lot of beans, whether it's green beans or limas or black beans. We eat a lot of tomatoes. We like things like sweet corn and zucchini and things like that. But one of the things we don't like are peppers. And so we knew a lot of the things we were going to grow already, except for peppers and that sort of thing. So those were things that were going to make it into our garden. So that was pretty easy, a first step, figuring out what did we want to grow. The next question is, how much do you want to grow? And if you're a family of 2, like I said, maybe you don't want to grow that much. But for us, just the 2 of us here, we wanted to grow enough where we could eat throughout the summer, but also so we could try to can some tomatoes and some beans, and maybe try to pickle some cucumbers and things like that. So we wanted a large size garden. And so if you look at our backyard, we only have really peaches and blueberries, but we've got a lot of open space. So we have the area for a large garden, and we decided to stick it on that side of the yard. Now our garden, each row is about 15 to 20 feet long, and we've got about 100 foot of rows. So we have about a 1,500 square foot garden, which is massive. If you don't want a huge garden, don't try a huge garden. It's best if this is your first year to start small and then slowly build up. My philosophy for this year was to make my garden so big that it was too big to fail. So I know some of these things aren't going to work out in my garden, and that's fine. But I thought if I planted enough different things, something is going to grow. And that was my goal for year 1. Now that you have your size determined, location is the next step. You want to plant your garden so your rows are running north to south. That way your plants get a good amount of light and it prevents them from getting shaded out. One way to determine this is to look at the sun. It rises in the east and sets in the west, so you want your rows to run perpendicular to the way that the sun is moving throughout the sky. You can also look on things like GIS or Google Maps to figure out where north is, and you plant your rows so they're going that direction. In my garden, I did this, but I also planted the tall plants on the west side. That means when the sun rises in the morning, the corn isn't going to shade out the smaller plants like my beans and my onions. So I planted my smaller plants on the far side of my garden towards the fence, and then they progressively get larger up until I get the corn on the far side of the garden. The last question you need to ask yourself is, how much do you want to spend? And set a budget. Now this is a big hurdle in a lot of gardens. Some people want to spend a lot of money and have a nice garden, and so you might be interested in doing something like a raised bed garden. Raised beds cost a lot of money because you have all of the maintenance that goes into getting the materials to make the raised bed. You have to buy the dirt and the soil for the garden, but you also have to get the things that everyone else needs, like your shovel, your tools, and your seeds and transplants as well. So that can really start to add up in the cost. A cheaper way to do it is just to plant straight into the soil, and that's what I did for my garden because I didn't want to spend too much money. Now my expenses came because I needed to buy a tiller. So that was a tool that I needed to break up the soil so that I could plant seeds, and that came at a pretty large cost. But I also needed a fence because I have 2 dogs that like to dig up everything and eat everything. And so if I wanted any vegetables, I needed a fence to keep them out. So those were my 2 costs when it came to budget. If you want a smaller budget, you can think about doing a patio garden. Something in containers is really a great way to start to grow some vegetables at a low price because your only expenses are the pots the plants grow in and the soil for those pots. So you can really get a nice small vegetable garden for only a couple $100. Those are the 3 main questions to consider when planning your garden. Now there's additional things like where are you going to get your water from, or how are you going to get it to your garden, that sort of thing. And we have the article and additional resources to fill in some of those gaps. So make sure that you look for those. If you have any questions, we've got a form so you can ask those questions there, and I'll try to answer them at the beginning or the end of each of these video series. If we have enough questions, we might do an additional video just on answering questions, because if one person has it, I'm sure everybody's got these questions. Make sure that you stay tuned for next week's episode. We're going to talk about how to prepare your soil and actually get started planting your garden, and we'll also start our first contest. So make sure that you stay tuned for this week in the garden.